Hello and welcome back. Today I want to talk to you about sourdough, making sourdough bread, making pizzas from your sourdough discard, just a few of the things I really enjoy doing. Right now I'm throwing together a dough so that I can bake some bread, and because it takes a while, I'm doing my stretch and folds, but it'll sit on the counter and do its bulk ferment after I finish these 4 or 5 sets of stretch and folds. So that gives me a great time to continue on with my sourdough discard and work on a recipe for some sourdough pizza. And that's one of my very favorite things to do because sourdough discard pizza does not require any additional ingredients. It is literally just the discard from your jar. So I'm going to show you how to do that in just a little bit. But right now what I'm doing is chopping up all of the ingredients that are going to go on the first pizza. And in my house, we do a lot of veggie heavy pizzas. In fact, I do a lot of plant-based cooking throughout the week. I pretty much only incorporate meat on the weekends, and that is because my husband and I are getting older. We're trying to eat a little bit healthier, and a lot of the animal products create inflammation in the body. So I eat a lot more fermented foods now, like we do the sourdough too, we make kimchi, we make sauerkraut, just a lot more fermented foods help cut down some of that inflammation and increase the gut microbiome health. So anyway, a lot of the pizzas we make are very veggie heavy. This one is an assortment of squash, peppers, onions, garlic, and mushrooms. I absolutely love putting mushrooms on pizza. And so what I'll usually do to make my kitchen time more effective is I'll do all my chopping and prep work, and then I'll start cooking. Or if I know something's going to cook for 10 minutes and I have to prepare something else, I'll do it during that time. I try to maximize my efficiency in the kitchen, and that ends up just becoming a lot more enjoyable for me as well. I love chopping, so I do spend a lot of time chopping things in the kitchen, but it's super fun for me. And anyway, that's what I enjoy doing. Side note, make sure you have a nice sharp knife, because I have found that I'm more likely to cut myself if I have a dull knife. So my husband is great, and he sharpens my knives for me usually every single week, and I'm really, really happy about that. So into the saute pan, I'm just putting a little bit of avocado oil. One of my favorite oils to use is avocado oil, and I like it because it's got a higher flash point, so it doesn't burn and smoke very quickly, but it also doesn't impart a lot of flavor into your food, which is nice because I don't really want to taste the oil typically. I want to taste my good food. So I'm just sauteing these. This maybe takes 6 or 7 minutes to get everything kind of wilty, and I found that's really one of the best ways to do these quick sourdough pizzas, because they don't take very much time to cook in the oven, and if you had raw vegetables on there, it takes a little bit longer, or they're going to come out not done. Now these are some herbs that I picked from my oregano and my basil plants outside. I really like adding in the fresh herbs whenever I can, and it's been summertime, so the basil has gone crazy, and my oregano grows pretty much year round. So I just cleaned them, and I'm just chopping them up a little bit, and then I'll set them aside because these will be toppers on my pizza as well. Okay, if you haven't done sourdough discard pizza, you are in for a treat. I have warmed up my stone in the oven, 425 degrees, and now I have my sourdough starter. It is unfed, it's not active starter, it's just been sitting at room temperature, and I am pouring some onto the stone, and I'm just spreading it out. And the crazy thing about this, if you use a hot stone or a hot cast iron pan, it already starts to cook as you're spreading it. It's really amazing. I don't add any oil or anything to my stones because they're really well seasoned, but if you have a newer stone or you're using cast iron, you may need to put a little bit of oil in there to season it a little bit. But then I just set my sourdough aside, and after this bakes, it takes about 10 minutes to do the first bake of that crust. I always separate it from my stone. If you ever used stones, they kind of keep cooking as long as they haven't had that seal broken, so I like to break the seal. And then I'm just adding some inexpensive pizza sauce from Walmart. I really like their generic Walmart pizza sauce. It's like $1.29. Actually tastes good, and I always add spices to it anyway, so that's what I did on this one. And I just sprinkled on some feta cheese because I actually had feta in the refrigerator. I don't typically do mozzarella because I'm lactose intolerant, and the softer the cheese, the more it hurts my belly, and the more I would have to take Lactaid. So anyway, the feta went on, and then I put all my sauteed veggies on, and then I did a little sprinkling of cheddar because I actually had a little bit of cheddar left in the refrigerator as well. So that's dinner for us. Now a little bit later, my my sourdough is risen. You can see it's jiggly and bubbly and so beautiful. So it's time to turn that out and get my dough shaped up. I've done several videos over on TikTok on my whole sourdough making process, and I'll start adding some more in here too. But basically, this is after the bulk ferment, and this is in super speed because most people don't want to watch it in real time. But I am just, my dough, my recipe, my basic artisan sourdough bread recipe makes 2 nice size loaves. So I divide it in half, laminate it out, and that's that pulling and stretching. And what you're doing is helping create the gluten strands, the crumb, the structure in there, and then you're shaping it to form tension on the outside of the dough. That way your bread comes out intact. So I cover that, I set it on my counter for about an hour, and then it goes into my refrigerator, and I always have to shift things around because I don't have open spaces usually in there, but it'll go in here, and I do a bulk cold ferment. So it's usually a 12 to 24 hour fermentation time in the refrigerator, and that is how you get that little bit of extra sour, and it makes it so much easier when you're ready to score it and get a pretty design on the top. So I go ahead and I get all of my stuff ready. I'm really big about getting things prepped before I'm in the middle of it. This is something that I didn't do as much as a younger homemaker, but I have definitely done this more in the last 10 years. Ironically, I should have been better prepared when my kids were young and living at home. Now that I've empty nested for several years and it's just my husband and I feel like I'm finally efficient in the kitchen. But maybe somebody younger can learn from me and start becoming more efficient earlier on. Anyway, turning out my bulk fermented doughs onto parchment, and I always dust them with a little bit of flour. That's just regular all-purpose flour. And then depending on the design, really decides which bread lamb I'm going to be using. Sometimes I make really elaborate patterns. Sometimes I just do simple, leaf patterns. Totally just depends on my mood. And this is just a pretty basic, simple pattern that I'm doing on here. It doesn't really affect the taste of the bread. It just is the look. These breads aren't for anybody in particular. These are just for my husband and I to have here. And if anybody stops by and needs a sandwich or a piece of toast or something, so nothing fancy. And I always cut that big groove in there, which creates the ear, and that's just to let steam escape. So it's actually a functional part of sourdough bread. You do want to cut the ear, even if it doesn't open up wide. You need a place for it to vent out the steam. Otherwise, it's going to blow a hole in the side of your bread. So when you cut that ear, you're determining where you want it to open up. During the summer, we haven't made as much sourdough here because it's hot. I'm in Arizona and it is so hot, and so we prefer not to heat up the house with the oven. So I've only been making bread maybe every 3 weeks or so, and I have a lot in my freezer just in case. But it just felt nice. I felt like my dough needed to be used, and so it was time to bake some. Now, depending on your personal recipe or whichever recipe you use, your oven, we heat them at different temperatures. My recipe, I'm getting my 2 Dutch ovens in there. It cooks at 490 degrees for 20 minutes covered, and then they cook at 465 degrees for 25 minutes uncovered. That's what I found works best with my oven. But if you're new to sourdough, you can use the numbers as a guide, but you just kind of want to play around and see exactly what works well in your oven. But this is how mine look. And sometimes I add an ice cube for steam, and sometimes I don't. It just really depends on the hydration of my breads. Okay, another discard pizza recipe. Like I said, we do this a lot. Now, she had risen because I had fed her and she kept rising. So it looks like this is fed sourdough. It's a little thicker, a little less runny than the truly unactive starter, but I hadn't fed her in like 24 hours. She was just still hanging on to the oomph and she hadn't shrunk back down yet. But that's okay. It's just a little harder to spread when the starter is more active like this. But again, I preheated that stone 425 degrees, took it out, spreading the starter on, and then it actually bakes in the oven for 10 minutes at 425 degrees. Then I take it out of the oven, do that separation where I slide a spatula or a knife underneath the layer of dough, and then I put my toppings on and I bake it again for another 10 minutes at 425 degrees. And I'm doing a slightly different pizza, so I'm adding a little layer of olive oil on top. I just thought that sounded really good this time. And I like to scrape down the sides of my jar so that it's cleaner and get it all well incorporated together. My sourdough starter is almost a year old. I made her in November of 2023, and she's done so great for me, even when I neglect her for several weeks at a time. Okay, so this dough came out of the oven, and it looks so yummy and bubbly, and I kind of wanted a focaccia feel to it, and I had some leftover salsa. My husband is Hispanic, and he makes absolutely the best salsa, homemade salsa. So we had some, and I wanted to use it up, and I'm actually making like a Mexican style pizza. This is one of my favorite ways to make pizza. It's so yummy. So spreading the salsa out, that's the base layer instead of tomato sauce, and it's already got all the good spices and seasonings in there, garlic, onions, cilantro, everything. I had some leftover yellow bell peppers that I had cubed up from something else I make. I make a lot of stir fry, so I never throw any parts of the bell peppers away. Even if it's just the top cap, when I take the stem off, I will chop that up or leave them, in slices and put them in the fridge, and then I'll use them again later. So now this is getting a layer of black beans, well drained. I always rinse my black beans. I don't want that extra sodium on there, so I rinse them and put them on there. And they make a really good protein on here because, like I said, we don't add a lot of meat. I'm adding a sprinkling of cumin on there just to make, a little more herbs. And then I'm adding some cheddar cheese to top this off with. And oh my gosh, it looks so good. Really excited for that. And one pizza like this, I cut it into 8 slices. My husband and I usually each eat like 2 pieces, and sometimes, an hour or 2 later, we'll have another piece. But then there's always pizza as a cold leftover for the next day. And I love that. Especially because my husband never thinks of food for himself. So I'm constantly like, okay, there's a piece of leftover pizza in the fridge or whatever. I try to make sure there's leftovers. But this turned out so wonderful, and it smelled so good. Okay, so like I said, these usually cut into 8 pieces. I just go ahead and cut on my stones. I've never had a problem with it dulling my pizza cutter, and I have had this pizza cutter since I was a Pampered Chef consultant 20 years ago, so it works great. And this is just a really simple, easy dinner to do. I highly recommend you try it, and you can embellish on the recipes that I've given you. Okay, so time to make another sourdough bread. I'm just going to take you through the steps. I definitely weigh my ingredients. I use this little bread scale. I think it was like $8 on Amazon. Really inexpensive, but it works great for making sure I'm getting as close to the amounts as possible. When I was in Oregon this summer at my aunt's house, I didn't have my I didn't have my bread scale. Obviously, I didn't have my sourdough starter. I didn't have my recipe. I know my recipe by heart, but my aunt didn't have a bread scale, and I felt so stumped with what exactly I should do. My ratios were off. Oh, side note, our filtered water, we ran out of the jugs, so I hadn't gone and picked it up yet. So I'm glad I had all these leftover bottles of water from my birthday party, adding in the amount. And by the way, in case you're curious, the dough that I make is 250 grams of starter, active bubbling starter, 650 grams of room temperature filtered water, 20 grams of salt. I like to use pink Himalayan salt, really finely ground, and actually I usually put about 21 grams in there, and then 950 grams of unbleached, preferably organic bread flour. That's the base for my dough. So there's the recipe. It works great, and I've had wonderful bread, and I have a really strong starter. I try to feed it during the cooler months. The bread, it sits on my counter, and I feed it every day, and I'm baking bread with it every 2 to 3 days, and using it down for discard things like discard pancakes, discard pizzas. I make discard naan bread, and it's just delicious. And then feed it and make loaves of bread, and then I sell my bread in the cooler months. So I feel like it's always going. In the summer, we don't have as much bread going, so the starter, I feel like she's not as happy all the time. I haven't had quite as big of rises during the summer, but I know once we get back into the cooler weather, that's going to change back up, and I'll have those nice, huge, fluffy loaves again. I'm not worried about it. One thing I also try to do is wash off that starter ASAP after I use it. Don't let it harden on your utensils or in your sink or in a bowl, because it becomes like cement. And if you already make sourdough, you will know that starter just turns to a hard cement glue. So I run lots of hot water down my sink, and I hit the garbage disposal, and I haven't had any problems. I know some people can't rinse it down the sink, but it's not a problem here where I live. So now that shaggy dough is formed, I'm getting a tea towel wet with warm water, and I'm going to cover the bread, and it sits for an hour, and then I do the stretch and folds. And typically I will do 4 sets of stretch and folds. Each set is about 30 minutes apart, and then I'll let it go for bulk ferment. I keep a rubber band around my jar, and that is how I know where the level is at, if it's risen or if it's fallen down. So here we go. Here's the stretch and folds. You just grab it, pull it up, and you let it plop down on itself. And so I do this on, like, kind of swish the bowl, do the next 4 corners basically, and then I always lift it up, and then I cover it back up, and then I set it. It'll sit for 30 minutes. I set a timer, and these are actually coil folds that I'm doing on this one right there. And then I let it sit. And after you finish your entire series of folds, I like these little, they're like shower caps. Get them on Amazon. They actually don't fit very well on my big stoneware crock bowl, so a lot of times I will whip out that cling wrap, and this is what I will leave on for the bulk ferment. It's warm here and it's dry, so that towel will dry out. I can't just leave a damp towel for 8-10 hours, or it will completely dry out. So I like to cover it with some sort of a different covering. So once it's good like this, nice and jiggly, you can see the bubbles forming. It's not very sticky anymore. I'm going to turn it out onto a lightly floured surface. And I flour my surface with a rice flour, because if you use regular all-purpose flour in there, or even the bread flour, you're introducing more gluten to your bread, and I'm not trying to add more gluten. I just want it to not stick everywhere. And in fact, some doughs, especially if they're a higher hydration dough, I found that wetting my hands and not putting any flour works better. But for this one, I'm just doing what I typically do. So I divide it in half, I lightly shape one and put it out of the way, and then I am going to work with this first one. So you just sort of push it out and laminate. That's called laminating. I laminate it out, then I fold it up on itself and shape it and put it in the banneton. So just a quick note on making sourdough bread. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be extremely time consuming. I know when people first get started with it, and even when I first started with it, it felt like so much. Like, how am I going to have time to do all this in a day? And yeah, I want to give the most nutritious, beneficial things to my family to eat, but I don't know if I have all this time. And I want to urge you, no matter how old you are, don't stress about it. Whatever you do is great. And if you add things like homemade sourdough bread, you're eliminating a lot of those refined processed sugars that and dyes and chemicals and things like that are in commercially available bread. I mean, if you have to buy that, fine. And once in a while I buy plain white bread just because I want a piece of toast that's not sourdough. But overall, it's just a healthier way to provide for your family. And if you enjoy the idea of homemaking and that cottage garden feel, it just becomes kind of fun. I didn't realize how much fun this would be when my kids were younger, and I wish I had taken the time just to embrace this 30 years ago. I'm glad I'm doing it now, and I hope you all are having fun doing it too. And just remember, you're doing the best you can. So I hope you enjoyed this today, and if you have any questions, I would love to hear from you. Have a wonderful day, and take care.